Usually, when we start a Let's Play here on our channel, all we do is talk for maybe 2 or 3 minutes on the title screen about what game we're about to play, and then we just jump straight in, without a lot of context. This time, I think we need to do things a little differently. So, probably the thing we're most known for at this point is our Let's Plays of the mainline Metal Gear Solid series. That wasn't a planned project, just kind of happened, but we started playing Metal Gear Solid 3 back in 2009, just because that game's a hell of a lot of fun. And it kind of turned into a decade-long endeavor to see that entire series throughout. And it wasn't just to see where the crazy story in those games would go and how it would finally all end, but it was also to examine the messy themes of those games and to examine the creators behind it, mainly Hideo Kojima, but we touched on a couple other people who worked on those games and left their mark on them. But we don't have any more Metal Gear to do. We wrapped up Metal Gear Solid 5 back in late 2019, and it's weird not to have that series left anymore, because if there is ever a time where we didn't know what to do with Let's Play of, it's shit, let's just do the next Metal Gear game, you know? We have a history with that. It was always like comforting, at least for me, to go back to Metal Gear. But thankfully, only a couple months after we finished our Let's Play of Metal Gear Solid 5, a remake of a game that I love came out that I've been looking forward to for a very long time, and it finally gives me a good opportunity to talk about this game. Final Fantasy VII. Even if you don't know much about this game, you know that for some reason, it's a big deal, and you could glean that very easily just by seeing how people reacted to the announcement of Final Fantasy VII Remake 5 years ago, back in 2015. I mean, look at my reaction. I was streaming it back then.
Many years ago, Square Enix released a groundbreaking title that went on to become one of the most beloved games in PlayStation
is it?
and video
Oh
game
my
history.
God.
Is
What?
it real?
No.
Tonight, I am
No.
proud to announce that by popular demand, we have a very special treat for everyone.
What? No! It ain't fucking happening!
What?
It's not real!
What?
Long ago,
It might be
we looked
real.
upon a foreboding sky.
Is this Uncharted?
The memory of the star that
What are we doing? What are we freaking out over?
It's real.
What?
Oh no! If that music starts like
Holy
this
shit.
pants.
for they are coming back.
Oh god, I'm shitting
Holy
my
fucking
At
shit!
last, the promise has been
Yeah! Fuck everything else!
Holy shit!
Oh my god!
Oh my god!
All right.
Look at all the crowd!
Fuck the rest of E3! Fuck you, I'm excited about this for real! I don't care! But for every reaction I saw that was like that, I've been seeing more and more reactions that are more along the line of, I don't know what this game is, what it's about, why people care about it so much to this day. And that made me realize I need to change my approach on how I handle this Let's Play. So here's the thing. Even though this is a remake, and even though Final Fantasy VII has been out for 23 years at this point, I am going to be approaching this Let's Play, along with my friend Grant, with the idea that people who are watching this don't know anything about Final Fantasy VII. So that means I am not going to be acknowledging anything that could potentially spoil the story of the game, even if the remake does something interesting where it's like, oh, this is how they adapted something from the original game, or oh, this is in the remake, they did this really smart thing of foreshadowing a later event in a new way that the original didn't. I'm not going to point that stuff out because that counts as spoilers, right? Speaking of spoilers, there are a couple spoilers that a lot of people know about, even if they never played the game, because it's just one of those things where through cultural osmosis, being on the internet long enough, somebody's going to say this or that about Final Fantasy VII, and those things are taken for granted as things everybody knows. That's not the case anymore. Like, I have come across people who don't know about a couple specific big moments from the original game. Somehow, they were never exposed to that stuff. So I am like kindly asking everybody in the comments, please don't talk about any of those spoilers, at least the big time ones, but I would really appreciate not spoiling anything in the comments because I really want to preserve that stuff for people because I don't have too many chances to vicariously experience Final Fantasy VII for the first time through other people. So like, don't ruin this for me, please. Another thing, while we were about to do a Let's Play of Final Fantasy VII Remake, it is not a remake of the entire original Final Fantasy VII. I know this sounds crazy. Final Fantasy VII Remake is the first in a series of remake games adapting the original Final Fantasy VII. It turns out that when you take a 23-year-old JRPG and try to blow it up to AAA game size, it becomes very hard to fit all that stuff into a single game. I understand there's probably some cynicism there in that they probably did want to stretch this game out into multiple games so they can make more money off of this, but even if they try to cram the whole game into one thing, I don't think they would be able to do it without compromising and cutting a lot of stuff from the original. With Final Fantasy VII Remake, this game is adapting about the first 6 hours of a 40-hour long game, while somehow turning that into a 35 to 40-hour game on its own. That sounds insane. It works, like, for the most part. You just gotta watch. Just trust me. With that, if you know a whole lot about Final Fantasy VII, you can probably just skip on to the next video where we start playing the game. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about this game for all of you who don't know much about the reason why this game is so important to a lot of people and the history behind it. And I gotta get this out here because once I started actually doing commentary on the game, I was too excited to talk about the game and I just couldn't get my thoughts out eloquently. So this is where I gotta do it. Final Fantasy VII came out on the PlayStation 1 in 1997, a little bit less than a full year before Metal Gear Solid released. And both of these games are actually known for kind of similar reasons in that they were both games that broke ground on how to present stories in games. While Metal Gear Solid was known for its very long, lavishly animated, fully motion acted, fully voice acted cutscenes that told the game's story like a movie, Final Fantasy VII presented its story a little differently. All of its dialogue was delivered just through text boxes. It didn't have any voice acting or anything like that. But what it did have was graphical power. When the game came out, it was a huge showpiece for the PlayStation and what type of graphics it could do. When you look at it though, all the people in the game are just kind of tiny little Lego people. They aren't that impressive looking. What was impressive at the time was the pre-rendered graphics. So Squaresoft at the time, every developer had a SGI workstation from Silicon Graphics, which were very, very expensive, top-of-the-line, cutting-edge desktop computers that were meant primarily for making computer graphics. And they use these workstations to make about half an hour's worth of pre-rendered cinematics for the game. And sometimes these were just used to highlight a cool explosion or something like that, but some of the game's most important moments are shown through those CG cutscenes. And it went even further than that. It wasn't just half an hour's worth of cutscenes in the game, but every single background in that game, outside of battles at least, was pre-rendered graphics. So while you did have real-time gameplay of 3D characters and other models moving around the screen, they were being projected onto a pre-rendered CG background, which had the advantage of allowing them to make far more detailed environments, which ended up being a very key important thing for that game, because even among other Final Fantasies, VII is pretty unique in its setting. And they were able to use those pre-rendered backgrounds to make the world of the game more immersive and more believable. And this was a big focus for the marketing for the game. And before we get into that, I also need to touch on what led up to that marketing and one of the main contributing factors as to why VII was so big. And that is, we have to go back to Nintendo first. So, for the longest time, Squaresoft had a very big working relationship with Nintendo. They made all of their games for their platforms. Final Fantasy started on the NES, it moved to the Super Nintendo, and it was taken for granted that Squaresoft was going to make the next Final Fantasy, number 7, for the N64 that was in development. But here's the issue. When Squaresoft was making 7, they wanted to be really ambitious with their project, with the pre-rendered videos, the pre-rendered backgrounds, just the sheer scale of the game that they were trying to reach. And this was an issue with the N64. So before Nintendo started making that console, Nintendo had a deal with Sony to make a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo called the PlayStation. Now, of course, that ended up not happening, which also means that Nintendo had to break their deal off with both Sony, making the console, and Philips, who were providing the CD format, which kind of, strangely enough, birthed both the PlayStation and the Philips CDI, which,
And with the optional digital video cartridge, your CDI system will even play feature-length Hollywood movies.
Movies on a CD?
I hope she made lots of spaghetti.
Huge piece of shit, good job. And this led to Nintendo not using CDs for their N64 console. Instead, they stuck with cartridges, and there were some major downsides to that. The first thing being, cartridges are really expensive to make, far more than CDs. And the other issue is that cartridges can hold way less data on them than CDs could. And so when Squaresoft was working on this game, they realized we can't make the game we want to make on Nintendo's console unless we heavily compromise on our vision, cut the pre-rendered videos, cut a bunch of other stuff. And so they made the big decision to switch over to Sony and make 7 for the PlayStation. So now, Squaresoft is making Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation, and Sony thinks that they might have a really big hit on their hands. Now the thing is, Final Fantasy is a JRPG, and that genre is, at the time, very popular in Japan, but it has never penetrated into the mainstream audience in the West. Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger and Earthbound, Super Mario RPG, all those games came out in America and other Western countries, but they were never huge hits the way Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest and other games were in Japan. So it was very niche, and that made 7 a big risk. So what Sony and their advertising partners did is they threw a ton of money at the advertising budget, and instead of focusing on the gameplay, they used the graphics as their main draw. They focused on the pre-rendered videos. But with that huge marketing push, Final Fantasy VII ended up being an immediate hit in the West. And what this did was expose a ton of people to a genre of game that they had never played before and most likely didn't even know existed, even though JRPGs had been published for years in the West before this. So here is a game that is doing new things with how it tells a story, is massive in scale in a way that had not been seen in games up to this point. It had a huge marketing budget behind it, had really impressive graphics for the time. All of those things hooked in a ton of people. And what happened is that a lot of people who grew up playing that game as their first JRPG, or one of their first at least, eventually led them to, down the line years later, very fondly remembering everything about the game. And that isn't to say that 7 didn't do genuinely good things or anything. It wasn't just the wow factor at the time. Final Fantasy VII, without going to spoilers, has a very memorable story that admittedly is a little convoluted and confusing in the original game because it had a not great localization, so there's a lot of dialogue that's worded kind of confusingly and makes some plot points harder to understand than they really should be. The game had very memorable stories, really memorable iconic setting, a great cast of characters, a really incredible soundtrack. A lot of the gameplay, although kind of old and antiquated now, the core ideas to a lot of the RPG style systems back then are still solid and work incredibly well in the remake with very little changes. And all those things lead to a game that appeared at the right place at the right time for a lot of people, and it just became something that stuck with an entire generation of players. It's very similar to Metal Gear Solid or Mario 64 or The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, in that they were all groundbreaking in their own ways and either exposing people to new genres that they've never seen before, or just taking an idea and pushing it to that next level in a way people have never seen before. And that led to what Final Fantasy VII is today. It has a huge legacy. It is the Final Fantasy with the most spin-off media. And speaking of that, so if you don't know much about 7, there's the original game, and then years later they started really capitalizing on the nostalgia in the mid-2000s for Final Fantasy VII by creating spin-off games and other media. So there is a Japan-only cell phone game that was a prequel called Final Fantasy VII Before Crisis. There was a PSP prequel spin-off game called Crisis Core. Then there was a sequel movie called Advent Children, and there was also a sequel spin-off game called Dirge of Cerberus, where you play as one of your other party members from the original game. Now, I was talking about spoilers earlier. If you want to stay unspoiled, don't look up any of that shit, because all of them were designed with the idea that you are very intimately familiar with the story of the original game. And don't even look up the cover art for Crisis Core, and completely avoid any info about that game, because that's probably the one with the most amount of spoilers in it. Please, if you avoid any of that stuff, avoid Crisis Core. I feel like I'm starting to ramble a little bit. I do want to briefly talk about Final Fantasy as a whole before we go on to playing the game here. If you don't know anything about the series, that's fine, you don't really need to. Even though this is Final Fantasy VII, the mainline Final Fantasy games, aside for some spin-offs like I mentioned with 7, are all completely separate from each other, different universes, different worlds. They are not connected to each other in any way. The older Final Fantasies, all the way up through 6, were a bit more of a traditional medieval fantasy setting. They started to get a little more diverse as they went on, starting with, Final Fantasy IV has a little bit of sci-fi in it. Final Fantasy VI is more of a steampunk fantasy setting rather than just a traditional medieval fantasy. It's a pretty wide type of settings that those games have used. And there's not really much connective tissue between them besides some commonalities either with battle systems or other aspects. The only real other connective tissue are some, kind of imagine how D&D has its own lexicon of monsters. Final Fantasy shares a lot of those ideas between each other. So you'll see a lot of enemy types or monsters get used throughout the different games. So there's tunberries, there are bombs, there are cactuars. These appear in a lot of different Final Fantasies, regardless of setting. And the same goes for character archetypes. There's almost always in Final Fantasy a character somewhere named Cid, and he is either an engineer or a mechanic, or he is associated in some way with airships. That's just the tradition of Final Fantasy. But aside from that, they're all pretty unique and different from each other, which is one of my favorite aspects of Final Fantasy, is that you never really get tired of it because they're always changing it up. But I'm definitely rambling now, so let's just go to the next video. Let's just start playing the game. I really want to show everybody how cool this game is. So yeah, see you later. Go.